So, welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. Before we begin, you may have noticed that CNU is having some technical difficulties with its website. Some other websites on the internet are having the same problem, so it's not confined to CNU. We expect to be back online by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, our membership portal is fully operational, as is our phone system and our social media platforms. So you can get in touch with us through those means. Thank you for your patience. And of course, I thank everybody for being here On the Park Bench. Let's see if we can go back. Okay, so today we have an authors forum, a new building in old cities, with author Steven Siems. The interviewer and moderator is Matthew Bell. So you can share your thoughts on hashtag on the park bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB feedback. But do that tomorrow, not today. And we're going to have an excellent presentation today. Steven Siems is professor of architecture and director of the Michael Christopher Duda Center for Preservation, Resilience, and Sustainability at the University of Notre Dame. He is also the author of The Future of the Past and the Architecture of the Classical Interior. Prior to joining Notre Dame faculty, he practiced architecture in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and New York. Matthew Bell is professor at the University of Maryland and principal at Perkins Eastman Architects. He teaches graduate urban design studios at Maryland, and his work in the DC region includes buildings and master plans for mixed-use higher ed and institutional projects. His buildings and projects have won several CNU Charter Awards. I'm sorry. We're going to have to go back again. I guess that slide is blanked out. But we will be hearing plenty about the book New Building in Old Cities, which is the focus of today's webinar. Writings by Gustavo Giovannoni on architectural and urban conservation. And first, there's going to be a presentation followed by a brief discussion between Steven and Matt, and then Q&A from the audience. Please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. So welcome, Steven and Matt, to On the Park Bench. I'm going to pass this along to Steven and Matt for the presentation. I'm stopping my share.
Okay. Do I need to share again?
You need to share again, unless Matt wants to say a few words.
Well, let me just say a couple minutes here before you share. So this is the book. There it is. New Building in Old Cities. Steven and several colleagues have offered us this really terrific book about Gustavo Giovannoni, who every time I see Steven, I say, why don't we know more about Giovannoni? And I'm sure he'll tell us more today. I'm very grateful that this is a virtual park bench because it's about 30 degrees outside. If it was a real park bench, the conversation might be a lot shorter. In any event, thank you for bringing this book to us, Steven. We'll start with a presentation by Steve on just an overview, I suppose, of Giovannoni and the book. And then we'll jump in with some questions.
Very good.
Okay,
all right. Well, let me get
your full screen share.
Okay. Is that appearing, Rob, now?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. My name is Steve Siems. I've been at Notre Dame for almost 20 years. And the last 10 or so have been occupied for my research with this project. And I'd just like to acknowledge my two co-editors, Jeff Cody and Francesco Saravo. The three of us worked together on this project. I did the bulk of the translations, but the three of us really worked on the presentation, the editorial format, and so forth. And Getty Publications, I think, did a superb job producing the book. So I want to just thank all of those folks. So today I'd like to share with you all the discovery of an important but neglected figure in the history of architecture, urbanism, and historic preservation. Gustavo Giovannoni, who lived from 1873 to 1947, was a central personality in the architectural culture of Italy in the first half of the 20th century, and he played an important international role as well. His contributions, though rarely acknowledged in the decades after the Second World War, are the subject today of renewed scholarly and critical interest. His professional and academic ideal was what he called the architetto integrale, or the complete architect, one equipped to practice architecture, urbanism, and restoration and teach them to the young. Giovannoni himself fulfilled this description, producing skillful designs for new buildings in historic cities, master plans for both historic urban centers and new towns, restorations of historic sites, and scores of scholarly studies in architectural history across all periods. It was truly what we used to call a Renaissance man. And to top off these achievements, he founded the School of Architecture at the University of Rome, La Sapienza, where he taught for a half-century and trained many noted Italian architects, including Bruno Zevi, Saverio Muratori, Luigi Moretti, and many others. After his death in 1947, his work was largely disregarded, or at least his work in architecture was, and his name was suppressed for what were deemed political reasons. Despite not having been politically active, his detractors claimed that he had collaborated with the fascist regime, a claim that, while strictly true, could also be made against almost all his critics as well. We know now that life in interwar Italy was complicated. A more accurate motivation for the architects to put Giovannoni's reputation down was that he had been a vocal opponent of the modern movement, an unforgivable offense in the eyes of post-war critics and historians, a number of whom had conveniently changed their political allegiances right after the war. For those who saw work like Turagni's Casa del Fascio on the left as representing progress and democracy, and some people did think that, continuing the traditional languages was regarded as both a falsification of history and possible proof of fascist sympathies. But Giovannoni's opposition to the Bauhaus and Le Corbusier was not ideological. Rather, he saw modernist urbanism as an existential threat to historic cities, their conservation and ongoing growth. This was not an idle concern, given Le Corbusier's 1925 Plan Voisin for the center of Paris, as you see on the right. In the century since the modern movement first appeared, we can evaluate Giovannoni's thought and practice with greater partiality, or impartiality. Or at least we should, because he has a lot of important things to tell us that are directly relevant to our challenges today. Giovannoni's built designs are few, but indicate his invention within several styles. His contributions as a designer are now being recognized, and he is once again regarded as a protagonist in the traditionalist designers in Rome between the wars. He's clearly a member of what has recently been called the other modern. Since the 1990s, Italian scholars have rediscovered him, and our work builds on theirs, making possible the first ever book in English about him. The volume includes 30 excerpts drawn from his writings on a range of subjects from throughout his half-century career. These essays are accompanied by articles, essays, placing him and his work in historical context. Most listeners to this webinar will find much in these writings that is familiar, but they are thoughts of a precursor who anticipated nearly a century ago much that we take for granted today, and who presents these ideas in an admirably comprehensive and coherent way. The book is organized into 6 parts around 6 themes and bearing the Italian terms used by Giovannoni. And I will summarize these parts and mention some of the takeaways you'll find in these chapters. The first is edilizia, which in Italian refers to both the activity of building and its main product, the ordinary construction, mostly houses, that makes up the private realm of our historic cities. Giovannoni drew the important distinction between monuments and fabric, and pointed out that the monuments derive their meaning from the fabric. Credited as the inventor of urban heritage, he declared that an entire city could be considered a historic monument. He introduced this idea into the 1931 Athens Charter on Restoration, the first international agreement in the field, and from there the idea spread across Europe and the Americas. The same year saw the publication of his most important book, Vecchia Città ed Edilizia Nuova, or Old Cities and New Building. And perhaps not coincidentally, the first historic district in the United States, in Charleston, South Carolina, was established the same year. Giovannoni insisted that no historic building could be considered simply as a freestanding monument without recognizing its relationship to the city or landscape that surrounds it, even if that setting has changed. Another aspect of edilizia was Giovannoni's focus on what he called l'architettura minore and we call vernacular architecture. While Giovannoni admired greatly and studied closely the monuments of antiquity, the great monumental achievements of historic architecture, he also valued the anonymous construction that encloses the streets and squares of historic cities and composes a picturesque urban scene, as in Giovannoni's beloved Rome. It was this collective work of art, as he called it, that provided the context within which the singular monuments could best be understood. He opposed the demolition of the medieval quarters in Rome that was then underway, and in Rome and elsewhere, for the sake of creating large, out-of-scale open spaces around monumental buildings, a tendency originating in 19th century Paris, visible in the area around Notre Dame, which you see in an old map on the right. Such clearances, which, for example, in the 19th century, they cleared away blocks of old houses to create the open plaza or parvis in front of the cathedral. Such clearances threatened the pedestrian-scale neighborhoods within which the larger monuments were embedded. The second part is called ambientismo, from the Italian ambiente, or environment. The meaning of ambientismo is close to our contextualism, but runs deeper. In the book, we translate the term as respect for the setting. For Giovannoni, the historic city was a living organism, and the term ambientismo denotes an attitude of respect for the city as it has developed through time, with its typological and material continuity, as in the Venetian palaces built in different centuries along the Grand Canal. But they have more in common with each other than they do with palaces built elsewhere at the same time. So time is more important than, or rather, place is more important than time. Additions to buildings or new urban neighborhoods should therefore promote continuity of character rather than visual or physical disruption. In contrast, and I thank Michael Dennis for this comical lineup of contemporary facades that completely refuse any kind of ambientismo or even to form a city street. Giovannoni saw old buildings as more than just documents of the past or specimens in an evolutionary architectural history. They also shape the city and contribute to the cultural identity of the citizens in the present. Ambientismo is also more than the abstract imitation of the physical surroundings, as in the postmodern contextualism of the 1970s and 80s. Rather, it entails a profound respect for the genius loci, the spirit of the place, including not only physical, but also social and cultural character. Ambientismo calls the designer to defend the city from inappropriate additions that could do as much damage as outright demolition. A comment by the great historian of the American landscape, J.B. Jackson, in my mind, perfectly captures Giovannoni's concept of ambientismo. Jackson said, quote, "In order to change a place, you have to first love it, because if you try to change it without loving it, you will only ruin it," end quote. The third term is diradamento, and it's the heart of Giovannoni's urban conservation theory, and it involves both the preservation of historic structures and the curation of public spaces. His term, diradamento, one of many botanical metaphors that Giovannoni uses, and it's derived from the pruning or thinning out of an orchard or a forest, tending it, trimming its branches, removing invasive growth, and so forth. Stewardship and care of an urban quarter on this model stands in contrast to the wholesale clearance of a Baron Haussmann or a Le Corbusier, or post-war urban renewal in the United States. Giovannoni seeks to maintain the city in conformance with the place-specific permanent causes that shape it, such as geography, climate, ways of life, local materials, and traditional construction methods, freeing the city from overbuilding or overcrowding, and promoting public life in public spaces. He does this by making incremental changes, removing non-conforming structures, opening up a view, creating a little piazza, allowing the district to breathe. Diradimento is character-conserving process that avoids both an uncritical preservation that would prevent all change and a permissive development that would significantly alter the historic character of the place. He does recognize the need for compromise, or as he said, bargaining between the forces of conservation and new development. His theory was first implemented in plans for the ancient Via dei Coronari in Rome, on the left, where the removal of a handful of non-conforming buildings allowed exposing the impressive sidewall of an impressive Baroque church and the creation of new piazze. A decade later, a follower of Giovannoni realized a diradimento of the Salicotto district in Siena, renovating old buildings and designing stylistically and typologically similar new ones, creating a harmonious and salubrious neighborhood. It's a pleasure to walk down this street, which includes a playground, and it shows a mix of medieval and modern buildings that go very nicely together. Diradimento projects were also carried out in Bari, Bergamo, and Assisi by followers of Giovannoni. But the most extensive and effective, perhaps, was in Bologna in the 1970s, where an extensive area of the historic center was rehabilitated and the houses offered back to the previous residents. In addition to rehabilitation, new houses, as you see on the right, were built employing the local typology, including the familiar portici or covered walkways characteristic of Bologna. Restauro, or restoration, is the care for architectural heritage in order to render historic monuments and cities as whole as possible, to the extent supported by documentation or evidence. Giovannoni developed a comprehensive theory of restoration, ranging from pure conservation to major rebuilding with new material. He sought a middle way between the strict conservation approach of John Ruskin and the stylistic restoration of Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. He identified the early 19th century restoration of the Arch of Titus in Rome, in the Roman Forum, by Giuseppe Valadier, as a model for restoration that makes the monument whole, while also avoiding confusing the historic parts with the restoration itself. The architect here completed the missing parts, but the new forms appear simplified and in a slightly different material, Roman travertine instead of marble. In choosing a treatment for a specific site, however, Giovannoni declares that there can be no fixed rules to be applied uncritically. Rather, judgments need to be made on a case-by-case basis. The restorer must recognize, for example, the different approaches called for by archaeological sites that belong to a culture that no longer exists, what Giovannoni, echoing an earlier French thinker, called dead monuments, and places that continue to house public and private life today, that he called living monuments. And a city street like the Via dei Tribunali in Naples is about as alive as you can get. Giovannoni codified his conservation ideas in his 1932 Italian Charter of Restoration, but this approach was superseded in the 1960s by the theories of Cesare Brandi, a figure closer to the modern movement and still regarded by many as the founder of the modern school of restoration. Brandi's approach prioritized the difference between new and old, which often led his followers to a modernist expression in juxtaposition with historic forms. Despite Brondi's dominance in the field, Giovannoni's approach continues to be an important minority position, and many of his views are enshrined in official guidance of ICOMOS, UNESCO, and other international bodies, though the source of these ideas is often unacknowledged. Today, we can say the conservation community is largely split between the heirs of Giovannoni and Brondi. Giovannoni's approach to new design reflects his view of the relationship between new and old architecture, and this is best expressed by the term innesto. The verb innestare means to graft, and Giovannoni, in another striking botanical image, describes an addition to an old house or the extension of a historic city as like grafting the branch of one plant onto another to create a hybrid. He recognized the need for change and to introduce new elements into a historic setting, but also prioritized continuity of character and minimum of contrast. Now, many years later, the ICOMOS Valletta Principles in 2011 calls specifically for continuity of composition when intervening in urban contexts. And the language of recent UNESCO documents on historic urban landscapes suggests the relevance of Giovannoni's idea of grafting as a model for a non-confrontational relationship between new and old architecture. Giovannoni designed a series of modest but telling additions to buildings in and around Rome in which he demonstrated his idea of grafting. His modest building linking the medieval Casa dei Crescenzi and the modern government office buildings seen in his drawing on the right, his new addition there in the center, the 3 bays with arches, does not imitate the pre-existing structures, but introduces new forms and a style that identifies the 3-bay work as an addition. Decades later, Giovannoni's idea found its way into the Secretary of the Interior standards with its requirement that new work be both differentiated from and compatible with the old, even if this formula has been subject to widespread abuse by design review authorities who stressed the first adjective but ignored the second. At the urban scale, grafting means that a large city like Rome should expand, not by sprawl, but by satellite towns, independent urban villages separated by green space and mostly founded on pre-existing settlements. These walkable mixed-use neighborhoods would be linked to the city center by efficient transit lines, like the English Garden cities under development at the same time. Giovannoni masterplanned 2 such developments in Rome, including the Garbatella district of social housing, whose plan for the first phase you see on the left. Sadly, Giovannoni's model was not followed, and sprawl has overwhelmed Rome, just like so many other cities. Finally, we arrive at the issue of reconstruction, which remains highly contested in the conservation community. Giovannoni supported reconstruction when there is sufficient knowledge of the historic condition to ensure accuracy, and when a community seeks restitution of its heritage and in defense of its identity. Current conservation theory is skeptical, seeking to prevent production of a mere copy, or worse, a fake. Following Brondi, post-war conservation theory has emphasized material authenticity over the appearance of wholeness, though other values such as original design intent or continuity of use should also receive consideration. Seeking a balance between material authenticity and community values, Giovannoni defended the rebuilding dov'era com'era, or where it was, as it was, of the Campanile of San Marco in Venice after its 1902 collapse, and that of the once magnificent Abbey of Monte Cassino after Allied bombardment destroyed it in 1944. In the latter case, little of the structure remained, but there was enough to establish the plan for rebuilding. Giovannoni himself had made documentary drawings 20 years before. In the rebuilding, some improvements were made to secondary areas, and an entirely new decorative scheme for the church was necessary. More controversially, the project's architect, Giovannoni's former student, Giuseppe Breccia Fratodocchi, designed a stylistically continuous new facade for the Abbey Church, replacing the previous unfinished masonry. You can see it there, the facade of the church sort of just in front of the dome at the back. That is a new design of sort of a neo-Renaissance design. Also, the architect opened up the cloister arcade to provide a view into the valley landscape below. These additions were seen as false by critics, but defenders recognized them as a way of completing the monument, an idea that only makes sense if one sets aside the rupture between new and old architecture. Giovannoni thought that completing an urban square by rebuilding missing structures or a community's right to the restitution of its lost heritage were more important than the conformance of a building style with its date of construction. Some preservation authorities, like Historic England, for example, are becoming more accepting of reconstruction, and the recent rebuilding of the Berliner Schloss and the center of Potsdam and Frankfurt and other monuments in Germany have opened up new debates that will likely continue for some time to come. There are many parallels between Giovannoni's writings of a century ago and our interests today. While the issues of sustainability and climate change were unknown to Giovannoni, his work shows us how to learn from the architecture and urbanism of the past, not only how to conserve environments already sustainable, but how to make new ones. His vision of architecture, urbanism, and conservation as a single discipline is what we need today to redirect our building culture towards sustainable and resilient new development. This brings us to Giovannoni's contributions to architectural education. As the founder of the School of Architecture of Rome, he had a lot to say about what architecture students should study, and it turns out to closely resemble the pedagogy that we have been using at Notre Dame for the last 35 years or so, starting long before we knew of Giovannoni. For those interested, if you capture this QR code, it will take you to a page where you can order a free downloadable PDF or paper copy of the book that the School of Architecture produced, exhibiting faculty teaching approaches and many, many student projects. So feel free to please order yourself a copy of that. Giovannoni's ideas were essential in developing our new Master of Science in Historic Preservation program, modeled on many of the values he articulated about the conservation and restoration of historic places and their importance for new construction. Paraphrasing the French writer Françoise Chouet in her magnificent book, The Invention of the Historic Monument, quote, "We restore in order to learn how to build," end quote. This would make an excellent motto for any school of architectural and urban conservation today. There's much else in our book on Giovannoni's theory and practice that I hope you'll enjoy discovering, but now I'll pass the microphone back to Matt and your questions. Thank you.
Well, before Matt begins, I just wanted to remind everybody to use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions, because we'll be getting to those in a bit.
Great. Well, as Rob said, put the questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them. Thanks, Stephen. That was really a terrific overview of a very comprehensive book, which I admire in many respects, not just being able to read Giovannoni's writings and the translation of them, which was obviously something that took some time, I imagine, but also the sort of preamble in terms of what to look for in each of the settings, as well as the pictures that illustrate some of these points. I guess the principal question I'd like to start with, Giovannoni, as you mentioned, was sort of cast aside by the sort of decades after World War II and the triumph of modernism, and certainly the approaches to historic cities, which tended to favor buildings which were modernist in style and character, and not buildings which were more compatible with historic cities. So today, what are the, in terms of the way we practice today, why is Giovannoni important? You obviously think he is, compared to what we're doing today in practice. And what are those principal lessons that we should take forward from Giovannoni that may be different in terms of, you touched on this a little bit, in terms of how we practice architecture, preservation, and building in cities today?
Thanks, Matt. That's a good place to begin. I think for me, reading writings that extend back pre-1945, really back to the beginning of the 20th century, in which I find an author who is not only suggesting practices, but justifying them and giving an intellectual framework and foundation for practices that we have struggled over the last 40 years to come to ourselves. And then you discover that somebody sort of had it all figured out 100 years earlier. On one hand, we sort of wish you'd had this book in our hands, a long time ago. On the other, I sort of feel happy to discover that there's this precursor who can assist us by helping us sort of have an overview that maybe we didn't have before. Maybe each of us was struggling in our own practices with some of these ideas, but didn't take a step back to look at how our practice individually relates to something much larger, something global. And I think the main lesson that I take from Giovannoni is the idea that architecture, urbanism, and conservation must be considered a single discipline. You have to have an overview of it. You have to locate the work that you do individually in that larger practice. I think that's the main thing.
And it is true, at least in my perception, in terms of architectural education or education in general, that these things have been somewhat atomized. I mean, you have preservation programs. I know at Maryland, our preservation program has kind of minimal engagement with the architecture program and things. And I guess what you're arguing is if you're going to study preservation, you really need to study architecture and vice versa, and that all has to be part of the same pie. There may be matters of degree in terms of what you emphasize, but you certainly have to include all of it.
Absolutely. I think there are many passages in the writings where Giovannoni will say something like, reminding us that there's an architectural component in urban design and there's an urban design component in architecture, and that they can't be separated. And I would just add preservation as a third member that cannot be separated, because if we are willing to give up this idea that there is this rupture between historic architecture and contemporary architecture, if we are willing to overlook that gap and instead see historic architecture and what we do today as a continuous process, then how you conserve historic buildings and how you make new ones are, maybe the new ones won't look the same, but there are ways that we can learn from the old ones how to solve problems that we're having trouble with now, like how to build a building that will last long enough to be sustainable. The word sustainable has a timeline, associated with it, because, if a building's only going to last 30 years, it's not, I think, by definition, sustainable. A building that can last 100 or 500 years, I think we can call sustainable. Well, where's the best place to learn how to do that? Well, if you're actually at the same time adaptively reusing a 100-year-old building or more, then maybe you can learn from it how to make more of it. So it's not about copying and it's not about imitation. It's about learning traditional wisdom and applying it, regardless of what century it comes from.
Yeah, and I think that example you showed of that 3-bay piece is really interesting. It both is compatible and distinguishes itself in the same way. And that takes a level of judgment that is not, it's not common in a lot of ways in which we practice architecture today. Certainly with the idea that additions to landmark buildings need to stand out as different.
Yeah.
But like you say, they've taken the different part and the compatible part and really separated the two things.
Well, let me mention two thoughts about that. One is, one reason why we see glass additions to historic masonry buildings is because architects aren't trained in traditional design. So probably understandably and probably justifiably, they refrain from trying because they might recognize that, well, I don't know how to do that, so I'm not going to try and then, do a bad job. So if architectural education, as Giovannoni described it, looked at architecture as a continuum and trained architects to function in different environments, different stylistic and material environments, then we might see less differentiation and more compatibility. The other thing I'll mention is the National Park Service itself waited until 2014, I think it is, or no, it was earlier than that, I think 2013 or 11, to revise its guidance in something called Preservation Briefs 14, which is a pamphlet on additions to historic buildings and how to comply with the Secretary's standards. Previous to that, all of the illustrations that the Park Service showed were modernist additions to historic buildings. For the first time in the new edition of Preservation Briefs 14, they actually illustrate traditional additions to traditional buildings that comply with the standards. Somehow or other, this hasn't trickled down to everyone in the profession, right? But as it says, the distinction, the differentiation can be subtle.
Right, and it's not necessarily stylistic at its heart.
That's right. It doesn't have to be stylistic. It could
Right.
just be a different historical language from the one that was there. I go back to the Arch of Titus. We want to show what is the restoration and what is the original or the historic, but we also want you to see the thing whole.
Right.
That's to me, that's the test, and that comes right out of Giovannoni's charter.
Your talk reminded me of a quote by an architect whose work I appreciate because he was in the knuckle between pure modernism and traditional architecture, Auguste Perret. And Perret said,
yes,
whoever has made a building that looks like it's always existed has achieved a great success.
right.
And I find that really sympathetic to Giovannoni's point of view. The other thing I think is quite interesting about him is he very much believed that cities needed to change.
Yes.
They needed to adapt, that you didn't freeze them in amber, that cities, he certainly tried to deal with the problem of the automobile and the problem with, sort of opening up certain parts of the city. As a student, I was very familiar with the Tor di Nona area that you referenced
Right.
in the book, and also the Corso del Rinascimento in Rome, where you can tell, at first glance, most people might not notice it. And they're relatively subtle, but they are changed and they are different. And they do exhibit both a sympathetic sort of, sfrancimento intervention, but also something which clearly is spatially different than what historically would have been there.
That's right. And I think the thing that was most critical for Giovannoni was recognizing that one could modernize the city without destroying it, and that he could, in fact, create he was the master planner, for example, for the Corso del Rinascimento, which includes new buildings as well as historic buildings along a new street that was created as a bypass for Piazza Navona, because the plan before that had been that they were going to drive traffic right through Piazza Navona, if you can imagine such a thing. So he was successful in gaining the approval of
moving it around the side.
Going around, yes. And so going around meant that he passed some buildings like the Palazzo della Sapienza, the famous church of San Ivo is there. And then his student, Arnaldo, I've just lost his name. One of his student
Brazzini.
architects. Sorry?
Brazzini? No,
no, not Brazzini, another B. It'll come to me in a moment. Who designed most of the buildings in a sort of somewhat abstracted style. Foschini, thank you, Ettore, thank you. Arnaldo Foschini.
Yes, did some work at AUR.
Yes, he did. But he was always this attempt to compromise between the modern and the classical. And in the post-war period, critics tended to see that as a negative. They saw that as sort of the fascist style par excellence. But for someone like Perret, for example, or Paul Kray in the United States, that was just a natural thing to do, was to look for a kind of synthesis between classical and modern.
Yeah, no, certainly the history of the 20th century histories of the 20th century tilt largely towards modernism. and don't cover a lot of these architects or cover them minimally who were doing very, very different things. He's fairly, he doesn't talk too much about building use and land use. He does, I mean, I always reminded my partner Stan Exted always says that great buildings oftentimes outlive their original uses.
Yes.
And Joe Vanoni's fairly mute on building use. Is this because he assumed that, you know, those sorts of things would take care of themselves, and that as long as you sort of kept the buildings, they would find, and they were good buildings, they were contributing in ways he thought they could contribute, that there would be ways to find. He does talk about the modification of those palazzi in the book where they get adapted to more modern
Right.
uses. But
Right.
Any other further thoughts about that?
I think it's because he was born and grew up in Rome. And, you know, if you think of a building like the Pantheon and you think about the uses that it has had and the meanings that it has accumulated over time. And, you know, buildings in Rome have changed uses, most of them, many times. The populations of neighborhoods have changed many times. So I think in a way, it reminds me of something that Louis Kahn once said, that, you know, don't worry about the program, just make rooms that are good for certain things, and people will find out, oh, this room is good for this. We'll use this room for this purpose. And in a sense, when you have a city that is that ancient, we find uses for things. And so now he was also a practicing architect, so, you know, function and purpose are important to him. But he doesn't worry about it too much because he figures, you know, if you make a building that's adaptable and well built, it'll be standing for a long time, and people will find uses for it. And I think that's probably correct.
Yeah, you know, and certainly if we look at it historically, some of the greatest buildings in history, and the Pantheon was a fish market at one point in time.
Yes.
Maybe that contributed to it being saved. Turning a little bit to this business of reconstruction.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about how our ideas about this. There's a question there about what, you know, would one view the recent reopening of Notre Dame in Paris as a reconstruction? But I'm also reminded of a sort of interesting parallel, the destruction of the Coventry Cathedral in England, and the attitudes about not rebuilding that after World War II. But in fact, some of the more successful reconstructions, like Warsaw, in the center of Warsaw, that's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, even though those buildings were fundamentally remade from the ground up.
You're absolutely right, Matt. This is a kind of schizophrenia in the architecture and conservation world, where on one hand, there's a great deal of skepticism about reconstruction and a kind of a fear that we're building fake buildings somehow. On the other hand, there's a great admiration for what the people of Warsaw did in the 1950s when they rebuilt the historic center of their capital, because not only because they need to have their city back, but because it was also a symbol of the Polish nation. So it was, and this is why it was destroyed, of course, because Hitler wanted to destroy them as a nation. So he destroyed their heritage, their physical heritage. They rebuilt it. And now the rebuilt heritage, if you will, the substitute heritage or the facsimile heritage is now itself recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so the question is, well, if it's okay for Warsaw, where else might it be okay? So the question comes up, well, Dresden was destroyed as thoroughly as Warsaw was, but by the winning side, let's say. And today Dresden is being rebuilt.
Right.
I was just there in June. I was just also in Berlin and Potsdam. And so the pictures that
They've torn down some of the Palace of the Republic.
They did. They tore down some modernist buildings that had been built by the communist government after the war in order to rebuild the previous buildings, including buildings by Schinkel and many other well-known architects. So the question becomes, when is it okay to reconstruct, and what limitations should be put on it? Joe Vanoni did think that there needed to be some limitation. He didn't think that you should just arbitrarily rebuild buildings based on old photographs and so on. But he was much more attuned to the community values, as I mentioned. people like, there's this beautiful passage I can't tell you now in which part, but there's a beautiful passage in which he writes about the dedication of the new bell tower in St. Mark's Square in Venice in 1910 when it was dedicated. And he talks about just the shouts of the Venetians and the ringing of the bells and the horns, blasts of the ships all at once, celebrating having their Campanile back.
Right.
And he says, who could have told them that they were wrong, you know, to have that feeling? So I think people are coming around. As I mentioned, English Heritage has issued a formal paper on the subject, again, making some criteria for when they think it's acceptable, but being much more open to it than in the past.
Well, you know, I'm reminded too of some thorny ones, which is the cities like Breslau that became Polish after World War II.
Right.
And the Poles really wrestling with how to, you know, rebuild the city and which parts of the heritage do they rebuild or embrace that seem more Polish than German.
Yeah.
And a very, very difficult question given the history
Yes.
of those places. But I think what Giovannoni teaches us is that in any of these questions, there's judgment required.
Precisely.
Not simply a white, black or white answer.
That's exactly right. It was he who sort of institutionalized the phrase case by case. Yes, there are guidelines. Yes, there are values, but values need to be balanced because often values clash. So it's like, you know, the ancient virtues, you know, you can be courageous and you can be prudent. Both are virtues, but sometimes it's difficult to be both. And he recognizes that when you restore questions like, what do we do about layers that are maybe related to painful history? You know, how do we treat those, you know, because not all heritage is happy heritage. There are heritages of genocide, there are heritages of slavery and so forth, as we know. So we have to make good judgment about how do we handle the historic parts of our landscape. I also saw there was a comment, and you, Matt, also alluded to Notre Dame. If I could just add one other little asterisk to that, the thing that I find most satisfying about the reconstruction of the roof at Notre Dame is that before it was done, so many people said it cannot be done, or even it should not be done.
Right.
Or they would use it cannot be done as a reason why it should not be done.
Right.
And so the fact that both of those objections have been answered, to me, is a kind of, I feel like we should tip our hat to Giovannoni, even though he didn't have anything to do with it, obviously, but it's something he would have very much appreciated.
There's an interesting question in here about sustainability. Given the increasing emphasis on sustainability, community engagement, and intangible cultural heritage and modern conservation practices, how would you address critiques of Giovannoni's principles, particularly conservative surgery and harmonious integration, prioritize aesthetic continuity over broader social, environmental, and cultural dimensions of heritage preservation? So try that one out, Stephen. You know.
Well, I would say, first of all, that he certainly did place very highly in his scale of values aesthetic quality. He was criticized for that after the war by people who thought that aesthetic considerations should be entirely absent from preservation decisions. Giovannoni would answer no, because people have aesthetic considerations and communities care about the aesthetic quality of their environment and so on. So it is something that has to be included. However, he also, I think, ahead of his time, required that we think about cultural and economic and political issues as well. In the book, there are a number of passages where he talks specifically about the social and cultural impact of either modern redevelopment or of conservation. And naturally, he argues in favor of conservation. Not only, I think this is one important answer. Not only is conservation important because of, well, we want to maintain our history, or we like old buildings, or they're pretty. He says, we also, if we look at, for example, the medieval quarters of Rome, the original form in which those neighborhoods existed, the original density, the fact that the courtyards were originally gardens, the fact that the buildings were originally 1, 2, or at most 3 stories tall, means that the medieval city of Rome was far healthier than the modern city was at the turn of the 20th century. And he says, if you want to deal with problems of slums, which basically many of those neighborhoods were at the time, they're now, touristically cleaned up. But, in 1900, the area around the Campo dei Fiori was technically a slum. It was full of crime and disease and poverty. He says, if we want to deal with those issues, one way we could deal with them is by restoring the medieval city to its previous form, because it will be a much healthier environment than, sort of high-rise apartment buildings would be.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, like I said before, most buildings outlive their original uses, and one could claim that, certainly reusing, enhancing, and allowing to grow in certain ways existing cities is perhaps the most profoundly sustainable thing you can do.
I would say so.
Reinforce settlement patterns that already exist.
Yes.
To be sure. Let's see, there's some other interesting questions in here. Someone's got a question about small towns. Person works in Charleston, and they can see how this methodology is really well used in an urban area, but how would you recommend translating it to smaller towns and suburbs that are being rebuilt? Suburban areas have a character specific to a time period as well, but often that time is gone, and now we seek to rebuild in a more dense urban way. What do you think Giovannone would say about that?
Well, he actually is very interested in small towns and villages, borghi, as the Italian term would be. And he spends a great deal of time talking about trying to understand, for example, how, the familiar hill towns that Americans love to go and visit, why are they the way they are? Why were they built where they are? Why do their streets wind, and curve? Why are the piazze the way they are? And he sort of picks up where Camillo Zitta leaves off and extends Zitta's analysis of the traditional European towns, whether hill towns or elsewhere. So I would say that he has a lot to say and a lot to offer to someone who is dealing with a rural, suburban, or small town kind of a context. It's not all about big cities.
And what do you think, Giovannone? I mean, so many of our historic areas and historic cities are facing sea level rise, and other, climate change imperatives. What do you think Giovannone would propose in some of these things?
Well, I would have to completely speculate on that because, of
Go
course,
ahead.
in 1931, these were not issues, although they probably, if we roll the tape back, we could probably see evidences of this even then. One thing that he was, I think, a little bit prescient in, or at least more than some other folks, he did see the impending impact of the automobile on historic cities. And he saw that the way that planners in his day were dealing with that was simply to bulldoze large areas of the city and make wider, multi-lane roads. And instead he said, let's just be really cautious about this. We will need to make some streets wider. We will need to make some new streets to get around. But let's try to do it without destroying the most important parts of the city. And part of that is that he recognized there are different scales in the city. There's the scale of modern life and rapid movement and needing to get across town. And there's the scale of the individual neighborhood, which he called the intermediate zones, which are probably between these larger modern streets. And he says, we need to respect those. And so he says, we should only widen as much as is absolutely needed for the traffic. Now, of course, in 1931, no one had any clue what it was going to be like in the year 2000. So I think that if we sort of extrapolate from that, his attitude would be, we need to do everything in our power to save places like Venice, for example. There's no question that he would be He would be, as an engineer himself, because he was educated as an engineer, I'm sure he would be greatly admiring the Mose, the gates and in the lagoon. Exactly. He would see that as exactly what we should be doing as conservation measure. I think beyond that, I would just have to say he would constantly remind us that the best sustainable measure is to make buildings and cities that last.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that. One of the things that is at the heart of the question in here from Professor Mazzola about the importance of his viewpoint as a professor of the practice rather than just a theorist.
Right.
And we look at certainly much of architectural education is turning towards people on faculties who do not practice architecture, but are writing and getting grants and doing theoretical things. But Giovannoni was sort of more of a practical visionary, wasn't he? Or visionary with practical sort of hint to it. Do you think there's a lesson for us in terms of how we structure faculties and architecture schools today? Because what I see in a lot of places is if you don't have a PhD, you can't get hired.
Mm.
And practical experience is just really looked down upon or shunted off to people who are just professional track faculty, not tenure track faculty. Do you think Giovannoni serves as any kind of model for that?
Very much so. We struggle with that here at Notre Dame. I mean, we are constantly on the lookout for practitioners that we can invite to join us. And the reason for that being what you just said, that in order to be an architect, in order to train other people to be architects, you need to have done it. I wouldn't want to go to a school of dentistry where all the faculty had only written papers about dentistry. I would want to know that my professor had actually looked in a mouth once in a while. So I think that Giovannoni is a model. Most of his colleagues at the University of Rome in that day were also practitioners. Marcello Piacentini, Vincenzo Fasolo, and so forth. So I would say we struggle with it because it's gotten more difficult to do. In that time, being a practicing architect, Giovannoni didn't build a lot, but he did build a number of buildings, and it takes a lot of investment of time and energy.
He also worked on city plans too.
Yes, he worked on city plans, and he, of course, dealt with governments. He dealt with, local authorities. He was also a kind of roving consultant on preservation and restoration projects. So like his involvement with Monte Cassino, he served on 2 different commissions that studied the problem of what to do after the abbey was destroyed, and sort of led them toward what they ended up doing. I think that his idea of the architetto integrale comes into play here. The integral or the whole or the complete architect has to do it all. And I don't know, if you look at, there are people like that today who both design buildings and write and speak, but also roll up their sleeves and go to the job site. And it's something I've tried to do, although I have to admit, at a certain point, I realized I couldn't actually do both of them simultaneously. So I did them, one after the other. But I think one of the things that we need to do that would be very helpful for our sustainability issues would be to find ways to enhance and to facilitate practice by teachers. I think the best definition I ever heard of theory, and I'm not sure where it came from, probably comes from Aristotle, like most things. Theory is simply reflection on practice. If your theory is a reflection on practice, then it has a kind of referent, right? And it's referring to something real. If your theory is not a reflection on practice, if it's just a reflection on other theories, I think you do run the danger then of becoming disconnected from the reality.
And clearly Giovannoni was sort of using the sort of case study model. He doesn't
Definitely.
say as much, but he refers to things very much in terms of, well, for example, here, this worked out well. And for example,
Yes.
here, I oppose this because I don't think it'll work out well. And it was
Right.
based upon, obviously, you know, the context is interesting too, where Rome is doing all these master plans towards the end of the 19th century as it becomes the capital of Italy.
Yes,
He's right there in the middle of that and
yes, he is.
experiencing a great deal of what the city is going to grow to become, and tries to be influential and talk about how we can modify it and change it and adapt it, and at the same time retain all the great things that about it that you know.
I've wanted to
You're
let-
right about that, Matt. And he uses a word, transazioni, in Italian, which I translate as bargaining. He doesn't take the position of an intransigent preservationist that nothing may change, nor does he take the position of someone who's, says, hey, let her rip, do what you need to do to make money and modernize. He says we need to make decisions that recognize both, because we do need to change, we do need to build new things, but we also need to protect what we have that's of value. So then that's where the bargaining comes in. So he understood that, and I think that's the correct attitude that we need to have today. We need to be firm in our sense of what we value and why, and we also need to be able to understand how we can adapt the world that we've inherited to the life that we're living now and in the future.
Well, all in the context of an architectural culture that isn't
Excuse me.
valuing those things in the same way. Okay, Rob.
I just wanted to let people know that we're past the hour point, but we can still answer a few more questions. But I wanted to let people know that we will be posting the video on the CNU website tomorrow. If they have to go for any reason, they can catch the last few questions being answered tomorrow when it is posted. And so I'll let you guys continue for a few more minutes.
Yeah, I just have one other thing really. People say it's a terrific book. Everybody should get it. It's incredible. I compliment you all on making it so readable as well and accessible. I think that's really terrific about it. It is so ironic, and the last question in the questions here is from Professor Camis, that Notre Dame seems to have embraced this as a point of departure for their pedagogy, but yet Giovannoni is totally unknown and almost prohibited at the school that he's founded in Rome.
Right.
It seems to me to be probably more the rule than the exception. Although, Corbu did say, life is always right. We architects must learn from that. And that the rebuilding of Dresden and some of the things that have been done in terms of reversing the sort of tragedies of many aspects of modern urbanism seem to catch, are catching on and certainly embraced by a great many places more and more. And your discussion about Notre Dame and as it was, where it was, is interesting, because there were so many places that have been rebuilt that are maybe technologically improved, but certainly not from an aesthetic point of view, valuing what was there previously.
Right.
And so cars may move better and parking may be easier, and but that's about it.
No, it's a shame. Things are beginning to change slowly. At the University of Rome, it depends on which department you're in. If you're in the Department of Architectural Design, nobody will have a conversation with you about Giovannoni. He's still regarded as, well, here's what Bruno Zevi wrote about him. He described him as an obstructionist who is standing in the way of progress. So as long as we have that sort of outlook, that trying to maintain continuity with our various traditions and knowledge is in some way obstructing progress, then we're going to, have that problem. But if you cross the hall and go into the Department of Architectural History, or down the hall, the Department of Urban Planning, or across town to the School of Conservation, you find that Giovannoni is very well known in those places. His monograph on Antonio Sangallo the Younger is still regarded as the reference in the field. His importance in city planning, I'm sure, Matt, you can vouch for this, is still high because of his work sort of in the tradition of Camilo Zitta and Werner Hegemann and other people. And in fact, Leon Creer discovered him in the 1990s, and probably I know has been highly influenced by him. I think also in conservation, all the leading books discuss him. Ucoletto and Glendinning, for example, in their histories of architectural conservation, give a lot of room to Giovannoni for his contribution. So Italian scholars have written. There's been a major exhibition of his work. There was a 3-day conference about him in 2015. New books coming out on him. So things are beginning to change in terms of his reception.
Yeah, and I think also the whole view of what the 20th century was about is changing too. Certainly, most of the historians have read about the 20th century in the first part of in mid-century were really advocates of modernism, not necessarily historians in many ways. There's an interesting thing here as well. Someone's put in about what's going on Maui, that the business owners on Front Street with the rebuilding of after the fires in Maui, they want to rebuild the town as it was on August 8th, 2023. So how do they reconcile designing with resiliency in the face of climate change and sea level rise? That's a tough one. But you can understand why they want,
I don't know
rebuilding
anything.
is always tricky.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about Lahaina and Maui specifically. I would think there certainly are many historical precedents for rebuilding a town after a disaster in a slightly different location. So, for example, southeastern Sicily, after the 1693 earthquake, we see several towns that are reconstructed, but not in the same place, but on maybe firmer ground.
Well, also more defensive locations.
More defensible.
And the same thing, places like Rennes in Brittany were rebuilt after a major fire in 1720.
Yeah.
And it was rebuilt very differently than what was there, but quite beautifully.
And I certainly would be sympathetic to someone who's wanted to say, well, at least in the street that was kind of the signature urban place of our town and that represents our urban heritage, I could certainly be sympathetic to people wanting to rebuild that more or less as it was. The question is, if it were in fact in the way of rising waves from the ocean, if tidal surges are going to inundate you regularly, then I would certainly look at what are the options for maybe building it on higher ground. And I know that then people would say, oh, but if you do that, then it's no longer authentic and it's a fake. Well, I don't think there's any such thing as a fake building, right? I mean,
no,
and certainly not any such thing as a fake
has a
city.
facade and nothing behind it.
Yeah, I mean that would be, a stage set would be a fake maybe, but so I'm not sympathetic at all to the argument that it has.
Yeah, I agree. I think there have been many places that have been rebuilt and they changed, but they were rebuilt very, very well. It was only when modern architecture appeared where that sort of mentality was trying to make something that was very, very different than what was there in the name of progress, where we ran into problems. And we see that, you think of places like Ypres, Belgium, that was rebuilt almost exactly the way it was, but with certain improvements after World War I. And then you compare that to places like Le Havre and things like that, which are very different, all modernist cities, not nearly as good, in my opinion. Anyhow, we should try and wrap this up here.
I would just say, Matt, as a final thought on that,
please.
The intersection of historic preservation and sustainability is what we should all be about. That there needs to be a convergence of those two fields, because like in the question of Maui, questions of how do you reconcile the need for resilience against a changing climate and the need to maintain, historic fabric. This is a question that's going to come up more and more. And so that needs to be our focus.
And, I think your point and Giovannoni's point is one must learn judgment.
Yes.
About these things. It's not simply do this or do that. One has to make critical judgments based on our knowledge and our experiences. And
indeed,
Giovannoni certainly was doing that. Well, look, Stephen, this has really been terrific. I've greatly enjoyed the book. Here it is again, folks. There. You can get it from the Getty or other places online. I think I probably got mine from Amazon. But congratulations on the book and to your co-authors as well. It is a remarkably useful and timely contribution to the discussion today about what our buildings and cities in the future are going to be like, and whether or not we have really the intestinal fortitude to look carefully at things that haven't been working and make serious changes and learn from sort of the critiques that Giovannoni's work offered to us in the 21st
Yes.
century.
And
Well, thank you, Matt. That's a great endorsement, and I hope my best wishes to everyone listening.
And thank you, Stephen Sims and Matthew Bell, and as well as Duro Tadani, who have put this together, and all the participants. See you again on the park bench.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.